criminal defendant rights in the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments. Introduction. The first 10 amendments of the Constitution are commonly referred to as the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights contains the foundation of the rights provided to individuals who are accused of committing crimes. These amendments affect law enforcement procedures and law enforcement professionals as they carry out their duties in different ways. The 4th Amendment. The amendment endeavors to protect the interests of a criminal defendant and the right to privacy and freedom from random raids. This is through the protection of the defendants, their houses, papers, and property against unfair searches and seizures by law enforcement personnel. This amendment forbids generalized searches and seizures of suspected persons unless circumstances put the general public in harm's way or danger. The amendment also covers searches and seizures in civil litigation cases. The 4th Amendment limitations are also applied to electronic crimes and therefore electronic devices. This amendment affects law enforcement procedures in that evidence obtained through unreasonable searches and seizures of defendants either during the investigation phase or accusatory phase of a criminal trial is not admissible in court. This also affects law enforcement procedure in that investigators have to seek a warrant from a judge to search or seize a person, property, house, or papers from the defendant. The amendment affects the work of police or investigator as it limits their actions during a criminal investigation. This means they cannot just search a suspect, his house, car, or papers based on suspicions. They have to give enough reason and evidence to a judge to obtain a warrant. However, the USA Patriot Act of 2007 gave investigators of domestic terrorism more leeway in the investigation of such cases than in ordinary applications by allowing for the surveillance of voicemails of suspects by obtaining a basic warrant as opposed to a surveillance warrant, which is slower in obtaining. The 5th Amendment. This provides a criminal defendant with 5 basic entitlements in the police procedures that may jeopardize their constitutional rights. These include, first, that a person accused of a capital or infamous crime be brought before a grand jury that is impartial and with no bias. Secondly, the accused be protected from self-incrimination by not testifying against themselves in the prosecution. This is famously called the Miranda Rule, where if the defendant thinks that answering law enforcement questions will incriminate them, may choose not to answer these questions. Thirdly, the accused has a right to protection against facing successive trials for the same crime either after conviction, acquittal, or multiple sentences. Fourthly, the criminal defendant has a right to provision that they will receive fair, orderly, and just prosecution proceedings. Lastly, they have a right to receive just compensation for any property taken by the government, for any purpose, using the current market value. This amendment affects the law enforcement procedure in that a person cannot just be arrested by officers, they have to be announced the Miranda warnings and either take them or forego them. The testimonies made by the criminal defendant cannot also be admitted in court as evidence. The amendment affects the arresting police officers as they have to always read the suspects their Miranda warning and detectives as they cannot just use testimonies from suspected criminals as evidence in courts. The judges trying the cases have to convene a grand jury in such cases and ensure that their selection is fair and that they are impartial in the case. They also have to make sure that the suspects receive a fair trial where everybody is heard and all possible evidence to prove the guilt or innocence of the defendant is gathered and there is no room for doubt otherwise, they can declare a mistrial. The 6th Amendment. This is applied in all prosecutions and ensures the defendant has a fair trial that follows due process. This has 7 provisions entitled to a criminal defendant and includes the right to a speedy trial that ensures the defendant does not get undue and oppressive confinement before proceedings and avoids anxiety, all of which can restrict them from defending themselves properly. However, this right can be revoked through a guilty plea. The second provision is the right to a public trial, meaning that the public has the freedom to attend the proceedings so that the defendant does not feel prejudiced. The defendant is also entitled to a trial by jury so there is no chance of oppression by overzealous or corrupt government agents. However, this only applies to serious crimes. Fourth, the defendant has a right to be given a notice of accusation which indicates the nature of the crime and why they are accused in more specific terms, to ensure that the crime they are indicated for is the one they are tried for. The fifth right requires the defendant to be confronted with witnesses against him and that he is present during the trial, which is not absolute as it can be denied after being warned the proceedings can continue without them. Sixth, the defendant is entitled to a compulsory process of bringing witnesses for their defense. Lastly, the defendant has a right to counsel to defend and represent him in the case, either a privately retained one or one provided by the state. This amendment affects the law enforcement procedure in that the trial must follow a certain procedure and that enforcers must act quickly to avoid violation of certain rights due to the defendant. The most affected professional by this amendment is the defense counsel, who must ensure that their client has accessed the rights provided herein. They must also ensure that the defendant invokes the right entitlements at the right time during the criminal trial. The Eighth Amendment. This limits the strictness of the punishment handed out to a convicted criminal by the government, either state or federal. This contains two clauses: the excessive fines clause, which puts restrictions on the amount of fine a convicted criminal may pay, and the excessive bail clause, which also limits the amount an accused person may pay as bail for their release after arrest and before trial. The amendment affects law enforcement procedures in that the criminal defendant released before trial makes investigations difficult, as the defendant can tamper with the evidence. It will also require the law enforcers to bring enough evidence to the trial judge for the setting of appropriate bail. The amendment also affects the work of a trial court judge, who has to make sure that appropriate bail and fines are set depending on the circumstances of the case.